Please be seated. And Jesus said to them, "Follow me, and I will make you fish for people." And immediately they left their nets and followed him. With these few words, it all begins. Mark's telling of the calling of the first disciples is short, and it's to the point. Jesus called, and they responded. Yet, I think this story leaves us with a lot of questions. Questions like, what exactly does it mean to fish for people? And how do we do this? Now, Mark's gospel is said to be one long invitation to the members of his Christian community to become involved in the mission of the community. So this particular passage, well, it must be the very first ask in Mark's long invitation. It's an ask that's been made to people like us. And it's asking people like us and us to be followers of Jesus and to share Jesus's good news with the whole world. Yes, this is an invitation to a type of discipleship that includes evangelism. So, how do you feel about evangelism? Now, my guess is that at least some of you have some negative associations with that word. I know that I do. Does evangelism mean walking up to random strangers and asking them if they have found Jesus Christ? Well, yes, that is one approach. That's one way that it's done. But you know what? How often do we get stuck in our discomfort with that kind of approach? And then we forget that evangelism is so much more than just that. I know I have. I remember very clearly the first time that I met Cindy. It was my first day of Peace Corps training. We were fresh out of college and we were excited to be going to Africa. We wanted to be teachers, to make a difference, to help in the world. And you know what? We were just as interested in figuring out who all these other people were that we were going to be doing this work with for those 2 years. What were you doing before you joined the Peace Corps? I asked Cindy as we waited in the airport for the shuttle to take us to the training site. I was studying mission. Oh, when will you go on mission? I asked. I'm on it right now, she told me. Now, 22-year-old me was totally taken aback by this response. In my heart, I'm saying, how disingenuous to use the Peace Corps, a U.S. government agency, as a tool for evangelism. It's just not right. Mm-hmm. But you know what? As I got to know Cindy over the 2 years that we spent working together in Lesotho, I realized that I completely misunderstood both her intentions and the meaning of that word mission. I had forgotten that all Christians living and working in the world are, in fact, evangelists out on a mission. We're out there sharing the good news of Jesus in just about every action that we take. Evangelism, following Christ and fishing for people, is in fact quite complex. And I had this one-dimensional view. Cindy and many Christians that I've known since this time have expanded my understanding of evangelism and eased my discomfort. They, in fact, evangelized me to evangelism. So what do we do when we evangelize? What exactly is fishing for people? Well, it starts right here where we are. We evangelize in this very Christian community. We continually re-evangelize each other by sharing our stories of how God has done and is now working in our lives and in the lives of this community of St. Philip the Apostle Episcopal Church. Each Christian community has its own way of doing this. The first Episcopal parish that I was ever a part of up in San Francisco had something called Minute for Mission, where someone stood up on Sunday during the announcements and talked about this, told a story of how God was working in their lives that week. Other parishes have things like spiritual sharing groups or covenant groups that serve the same purpose. How do we do it at St. Philip's? How do we share this good news with each other? I think we do it in a lot of different ways. I think coffee hour works this way, and prayer chain works this way, and theology book group works this way, and even worship works this way for us. God is great. God is active in our lives, and we can't help but share this with each other. Now, that's not the end point of evangelism for us. Gretchen Wolfe Pritchard of the now classic Sunday paper, which were those Xerox bulletins from the 1980s that were used for coloring, well, she reminds us that we also need to evangelize our children. Now, I'm sure that a lot of us were probably evangelized as children by our parents and by the church in which we grew up. I definitely remember my parents having us say grace at every meal and teaching us about Christ's love and forgiveness, as well as modeling it in our family life. I imagine that many of you have these same kinds of memories. I especially remember my parents bringing us to church. I grew up in 2 churches, and each had their own part in my formation as a Christian. My father's Roman Catholic Church taught me the faith. It challenged me to live it through 10 years of catechism class, First Communion, confirmation, and Catholic youth group. And it was a whole childhood's worth of gathering Sunday after Sunday to be fed at Christ's table. Now, my mother's Lutheran church provided a small community where I knew everyone and everyone knew me and they cared about me, as well as some of my most powerful childhood experiences of God in Christian community at Lutheran summer camp just up the road here. So, how were you formed as a Christian? How were you evangelized? This is the work of all of us. Now, how we do it at St. Philip's, how we evangelize our children and grandchildren, well, that's an open question. How are we sharing the power and the joy of God being in our lives with the next generation? Now, Sunday school is the explicit part of this, but as my childhood experiences and probably yours say, evangelizing our children and forming them in faith is so much more than just that. It's about how we welcome children into our community of worship and fellowship and ministry, how we invite their gifts. You know what? It's clear to me from the stories that the St. Philip's young adults have told me that that's part of the DNA of who St. Philip's is. We are good at that. So the question for now is, how do we keep doing this for the COVID generation of children that has missed being able to gather in a warm and welcoming church that invites their participation? That's one of our biggest challenges as we walk forward into 2021. We also know that sharing the good news of the kingdom is not something that stops at our church doors. Now, the Methodist Church that's at the end of my street has a sign at the exit of their parking lot that says, "Attention, you are now entering a mission field." In other words, walking out the church door is where the fishing really starts. And I think your glass doors, they kind of give that same message. There's no barrier between what we do here in church and what we do once we walk outside. And you know what? We do this kind of evangelism whether we realize it or not. As I had learned from my colleague in Peace Corps, we begin sharing the gospel simply by living as Christians in the world. Some call this evangelism by example, but even that makes it sound like we're thinking about it. And I think that the power of God working in our lives is so strong that we just can't help but show it. It's that idea of the light shining forth from within us. You all and me, each and every one of us, we are walking proclamations of the good news of God's love in Jesus Christ, and that good news at work in us, and it shines out wherever we go. This is an awesome responsibility, living the Christian life and knowing that. But I also wonder sometimes if God meant for us to just kind of forget about that sometimes. I wonder if we end up doing a better job if we aren't consciously and sanctimoniously trying to set an example. So keep on living that life of following the way of Jesus and just be open for what happens. You know, I hope you weren't afraid that I would get to this part, but there is also the active proclamation of the gospel to the world. That's part of evangelism too. Now, going door to door is one way, but it's not really the Anglican way. It's kind of just not our style. So how do we share the good news with the world? Well, I think that we let people know how God is working in our lives, and we let people know that it is God who formed and shaped who God intends us to be. And you know what? We let people know that we just can't be otherwise. We also have to let people know that there's another way than the one that we see modeled in our culture that is all about acquisition of wealth and power at any cost. Sometimes fishing for people requires hooks, barbed hooks, as well as just nets. Now, this is kind of a different take on the fishing image that we are used to. Chad Myers, in his groundbreaking book on Mark's Gospel called Binding the Strong Man, reminds us that the image of fishing for people is in fact deeply rooted in the calling out of injustices and its perpetrators also. Chad Myers traces that image right back to the Old Testament prophets. He finds it in Jeremiah and Amos and also in Ezekiel. In that particular context, the image is always used to call out the leaders of Israel and to call them away from their abuses of power and back to the ways of God's covenant. And it's especially used to remind them of their responsibility to care for the widows and the orphans and the most vulnerable among us. Now, I am well aware, as I'm sure you are, that the public image of Christianity on this particular front has taken a serious beating as of late. But there has also been a witness to the good news rising up among all of this chaos too. I've read both public statements and personal testimonies in the mainstream press, as well as all over social media these past couple of weeks, written by Christians from all sorts of walks of life. All of them felt that they had to somehow come out and say something to the world, say that it is Christians' fervently held faith and hope that there has to be a way for our society to work together, to be the one where all of us have access, every last person, to all of the resources that we need to live and to thrive. And also to put out there that it is the gospel, the good news, that is the source of that faith and hope. I feel like this past year is full of examples who have done this kind of thing in all sorts of ways. There's the people who have, from churches who've gone out there and marched in Black Lives Matter marches across the country because they believe that their Christian faith calls them to fight racism and economic justice. All of that is Christian witness. It's Christian evangelism. Now, I'm not trying to say that you as a Christian have to be a political activist any more than I was saying that you had to go out and knock on people's doors. You may find that your faith brings you to different conclusions of how you are called to use your gifts to fish for people. I'm only trying to give you some examples of how some Christians have heard the message that's so powerful in their lives that they just had to share it with the world in those ways. There are all sorts of different ways that we can be doing this. So, how do we at St. Philip's cast our nets out into the turbulent seas of the world in which we find ourselves today? I know we do this by example, and I have confidence that this Zoom is full of living, breathing Christians who go on being living, breathing Christians when you click that little red Leave Meeting button each Sunday. I know that we stand right here on this corner on the main drag of Scotts Valley, and we declare Christ's welcome to all who pass up and down the street each day. Even as we meet virtually during COVID, we are spreading the good news of Christ's love each week to families that we serve by Pip's Pantry and all sorts of other ways. Maybe there are still ways that we could yell a bit louder too. What do you all think? I would love to hear your ideas. I mean, how are we doing as fishers of people out there in the world in this time and in this place, in this moment? How are we called right now to witness to the good news of God's way of love made known for us in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus? Our presiding bishop, Michael Curry, had a few suggestions in his opening remarks to the Executive Council of the Episcopal Church on Friday. I just want to read you a part of what he said because I think there's a lot in here that we really need to hear. He wrote, or rather he spoke, "We need to reach out to each other across our differences, across the divides. We need to reach out and bless each other as people made in the image of God, as children of God, as brothers and sisters, as siblings. And in so doing, we will help to save a democracy and maybe a world. And I know we must be advocates for justice. We must. But justice is not enough. We must stand for equal rights. But equal rights by themselves are not enough. We must make sure children have food. No child in this country or in this world should ever be hungry. But that is not enough. Bread alone is not enough. We must repair the spirit as well as the flesh. Public policy must change for the good, but our personal morality must change towards love. And in so doing, there may be hope." So, evangelism in our time means spreading the net of God's way of love in all of those ways. In our Christian community, to our fellow travelers and our children, but also out there in the world by living, ministering, and declaring that reconciling love of God, reaching out across divisions and differences to build peace and common purpose again. Does this seem like a big job to you, that job of disciple? It certainly does to me. Well, maybe that's why we are a community that gathers together in prayer each week, because we can't do it by ourselves. So go on evangelizing. Go on following Jesus and fishing for people. Go on forming and renewing each other and sharing that good news with the world. In what you are and in everything you do, you are declaring God's love. Amen.